If I told you that there is a property on the market right now that the average investor looks at as a money-losing, cash flow negative apartment development, but we see it as an opportunity for our clients to 3x their money in only 2 years. So the interesting thing about this is that it's not some secret off-market deal or something that we had to jump through a ton of hoops to accomplish with the development. It's really just sitting in front of everybody. Most people just don't know the zoning and how to find and analyze this deal. So today we're going to show you exactly how we're analyzing it, where the profit comes from, what could kill the deal, and also why this type of property we're looking at every single week. And then also stick around, because before we even get to the deal, we're actually going to talk about one education piece, which is economies of scale, that could save you from making a very expensive mistake on your next infill project. So whether you're basically looking for an infill project for yourself or you're just trying to get information, we're trying to bring you education every single week on top of our deals that we analyze and send out, so that you can be more educated, but also make a confident decision on whether you want to buy a deal or not. And before we jump into the deal, we're going to talk a little bit about, I guess, first of all, my background. If we haven't met yet, my name is Zach Matson. I'm a developer and builder here in Boise, Idaho, and I've been investing in real estate since 2013. So I started house hacking by buying duplexes. I bought a couple of duplexes within a couple of years, lived in one side, rented out the other. And then I transitioned to flipping full-time in 2016 and then getting into infill development full-time in 2019 and 2020. And that's where I really saw the opportunity for myself to be able to scale the way I had wanted to scale. So today, my team and I specialize in taking properties that most people see as a single house or an ordinary lot and looking for ways to create more value through lot splits, subdivisions, ADUs, and new construction. We've analyzed thousands of properties. In fact, in the last year, probably 1,000 properties, and have personally gone through the entire process from buying the property to entitlements, to horizontal development and building and selling the homes and even owning rentals. And so every Friday, we're going to take a look at what we're seeing in the market and break down one of the best, most interesting opportunities that we found that week. And so again, whether you're an experienced investor, a realtor, or just trying to figure out how this whole infill development process works, you're in the right place. So I'm going to start calling this our little Infill 101, our education segment. And this week's infill education is all about economies of scale. So it's a little bit funny to think about with infill development, just because by definition, infill development or most infill projects don't have the kind of scale that you see with normal development. When a lot of people think about development, you're thinking about, the hundreds of acres that a builder is developing that's just on the outskirts of town. And so we're not talking about hundreds of acres or even 40 acres. In fact, most of the time, I'd say 80% of the time, our properties that we look at are on an acre or less. So we're talking about smaller scale, just naturally infill projects, but that's also why economies of scale matter. And there's a few reasons or a few ways that we look at economies of scale on every level or every step of the process. So number one is on the purchase. So whether you're purchasing bare land or on a larger property with a home that already sits on the property, the economies of scale really apply to the acquisition price of the land that you're going to build on. So for example, if you're buying just a single house and you're splitting off one lot, but you're not paying any extra for that land, well, you're getting that land for free. Another example is if you're buying just a piece of raw land. So let's say, for simplicity, let's just say it's an acre. And let's say you are deciding you only want to put 2 houses on it, or the zoning allows for 2 houses on it, and your acquisition price of that lot is $100,000. Well, if you only put 2 houses on it, your acquisition price per lot is $50,000. That's just for the land. We're not talking about anything past the land. So just the land is $50,000. But let's say that the zoning actually allows for 4 units per acre, and you can actually put 4 houses on it. Well, now your acquisition price got cut in half, and now you're talking about $25,000 per unit instead of $50,000 per unit. Or if you have a little bit higher density area and you can actually put 10 homes on that same acre, now you're talking about it's only a $10,000 acquisition price per lot. And most of the time, what we find in infill development is because it's already within city limits, most of the time, the house that you design and build and sell on that lot, it doesn't matter if you have 10 units an acre or 2 units an acre, they're basically going to sell for about the same price. Now, depending on the neighborhood and area, that that may or may not be the case, but in general, as generalization, you're typically, the more units you can fit, as long as it fits the neighborhood and what's already going on there, the lower your acquisition price per unit is going to go, and the more that leads to a profitability, higher profitability, or being profitable at all. The next phase that you can apply the economies of scale to is entitlements. So in general, there is a floor to entitlement costs. So again, taking that same project on 1 acre, if you're entitling it for 2 lots, typically the entitlement cost is going to be, there's going to be a floor to that. Let's say that floor is 50,000. That's probably pretty close, but so then you're looking at 25,000 per unit. But if you entitle 4 lots versus just those 2, now your total entitlement cost, it's not going to double. It's actually going to only go up to maybe like 60,000. So now your entitlement cost per unit is only 15,000. And so you've reduced your cost per unit by 10,000. Or let's say you go to that 10 units again, and now your entitlement cost might only be 100,000 total. And now your entitlement cost per unit is only 10,000 per unit. So now you figured out a way to incorporate those economies of scale from doing 2 units to 10, and now you've reduced your price $40,000 on the land acquisition and another 15,000 per unit on the entitlements, and you've actually saved $55,000 on your per unit cost before you even break ground. And again, especially when we're talking about between 2 units and 10 units, a lot of times that's where your entire profitability comes in for your project. Because we'll talk about this in a second, but because that per unit cost is more controllable on the front end than it is on the tail end. And that's where I see a lot of even like either first time investors that are doing their first development deal go wrong. They're not looking at these things. But I've even seen, experienced investors and experienced developers, not paying attention to this thing, and then all of a sudden they try to sell a project that they're going to end up losing money on because they didn't maximize the density or minimize their cost on their project. So the next area that this applies to is horizontal development. And when I talk about horizontal development, that's all the infrastructure that goes into that property. So we're talking utilities, basically anything underground or at ground level. So we're talking sewer, water, power, roads, sidewalks, curb gutter, all that fun stuff. Sometimes you have to have street lights and fire hydrants. Basically anything that before you actually build the houses themselves, all that infrastructure that has to go in. So on infill development, this is already usually cheaper than land outside of town, because most of the time with infill development, all the utilities are right in the street, right next to the property. So you're not having to bring them in hundreds of yards typically, or in some cases miles on bigger developments. So you're just typically you still have to bring in maybe a common driveway or a private lane. And so you still have to bring utilities and create that road going into the subdivision, but it's not significant infrastructure. And so when you build, let's say, again, if you're building 2 houses versus 10, a lot of times you have to do the same kind of infrastructure on those 2 houses that you do have on the 10. So you have a floor to that development cost, and your per unit cost, once you get to that floor level, your per unit cost goes down each time as you add properties or add density, because it doesn't cost that much to run an extension of like sewer and water to a house versus having to put that sewer main in there in the first place. So your per unit cost goes up slightly, but it goes down in general because you have more properties to share that floor cost with. So ultimately it lowers your per unit cost to develop. And that's where, again, you see some pretty significant cost per unit when you can get higher density. And then the last part is on the actual builds, on the vertical. So this is really the third phase, and this is where your economies of scale don't really apply as much. So many things with the vertical construction, it's going to be the same cost no matter what. You know, a lot of builds are, it's price per square foot. That's how subcontractors charge. You can kind of roughly figure out cost per square foot on materials, and it's hard to get bulk discounts. Not that there aren't bulk discounts, but they're just not usually significant. So you're talking about maybe a few percentages. And then same thing with subcontractors. So sometimes, if you approach subcontractors, and we do this on our bigger developments, is, we'll approach our subcontractors and say, okay, if we give you these 10 houses that we're going to build, if we have you do it all at the same time or hire you for everything, can you work with us on the price a little bit and reduce your cost a little bit? And sometimes they'll do that. Sometimes our subs don't have a lot of overhead anyway, so they're already giving us a really good deal. So we also want to take care of our subcontractors, so we're not trying to nickel and dime everybody, but sometimes there's a little bit of opportunity to get some economies of scale there. And then along with that too, if for example, if you're building townhomes versus detached single family homes, you have shared common walls. So sometimes that's why townhomes are, they're less expensive than detached single family, because they're less expensive to build, because some of those shared costs kind of go down. So ultimately, even though we're dealing with smaller scale projects in general with infill development, there's still economies of scale that we can achieve to reduce that cost per unit. And so that's why a lot of times, when people that are familiar with our deals that we send out, when we send out deals that are just a single split, for example, and a lot of those are great deals, but a lot of times those have about the same cash out of pocket as some of our bigger deals that are, maybe 10 units. And the reason why that is because you get that economies of scale, because your per unit cost doesn't go up that much. And a lot of those per unit costs, or those unit costs, are out of pocket on the front end. And so your out of pocket costs go up a little bit, but not by the same amount of, it's not the same per unit as you're just buying one house. So, a lot of times our deals are, our single splits might cost you 200,000 out of pocket, maybe more, maybe less. But then you might see a 10 unit development that only costs 250 out of pocket, or 300 out of pocket. And for 10 times the units, you don't have 10 times the cost out of pocket. And it's really just because of those economies of scale and the way the lenders look at things as well. So let me just show you some examples here from our deal list. And actually, before we jump too far into the deal list, for those of you that are watching this the first time, a lot of people watch this recording. What I'm going to show you here is our infill deal list, and this is the spreadsheet that we track every single infill deal in our 3 markets that we follow. So we follow Boise, Garden City, and Meridian. And so we see potential infill deals come across the market every single day. If they have some kind of potential to develop, we put them on our spreadsheet. And then we also occasionally get off-market deals. Probably about once a month, we have a off-market deal that comes across our desk. Sometimes those are good deals, sometimes they're not. But then we do a high-level analysis using our known costs to entitle, develop, and build. And so we come up with a quick analysis of what the potential is for this deal. So you'll notice as we pull this up here in a second, that many of the deals on the list either don't make money, or they lose money, or they just haven't been underwritten yet. So we put every deal on the list, whether a lot of times I can, like, one of my superpowers, I can basically look at a property and know what can be done with it, but I also have a really good idea if it's going to be a good project or not. I don't necessarily know the numbers off the top of my head, but I know if it's going to be a good deal or not. So I still put it on the list, even if I know it's not going to be a good deal, because we track these. And so a lot of times what happens with the deals that, lose money is, or that show that they're going to lose money on our list, is a lot of times they don't sell and then they sit on the market for a long time. And then it gives us an opportunity to maybe go to the listing agent and say, hey, it's been sitting on the market for a while. This is why we want to make you this offer. Or it goes, maybe it goes, what we see a lot of times on those overpriced deals is it gets expired. And then we can actually reach out to those sellers directly after they're out of contract with the listing agent and try to get a better deal just buying it straight from the seller. So those are always options, and that's why we track every deal, even if it's not a good deal. And then the other thing you'll notice is deals that aren't underwritten fully. And again, that comes down to a lot of times, I know pretty much instantly whether it's going to be a good deal or not. And or just the amount of effort it's going to take to put in the underwriting. Some deals are really quick for us, but some of them that are a little bit more extensive, we have to put a little bit more time into. And again, we put that time into the ones that we know are really good deals, but if they're not as good, they're kind of on the back burner a little bit until we have more time to do that. Yeah, without further ado here, I'm going to pull up my share screen and show our deals. Okay, so before I get into this week's deal, I'm just going to talk about the economies of scale on a couple of deals. So this column here is where I'm looking at the total additional units. So most of the time this is lots, but sometimes it's, for multifamily deals on a different tab, it's the total doors. But so for example, this is actually a deal that came on the market this past week, this U-Stick Road, which by looking at this, the purchase price, you're like, oh, that's a pretty good deal for a house. It's 760 square feet. Honestly, it's probably a little high, especially for the condition, but it seems like an entry-level price, especially for something that you can develop. But what I look at here is, okay, so now you're looking at the house itself for the condition it's in. When you look through the pictures and kind of look at what's similar is sold, it's probably only worth 280. So then you're paying, basically an extra 40,000 for the land. And so when we break that down into an additional 3 units that we can add, that's about 13,000 per unit. Now, normally that's actually not bad. That's not a bad deal. Ideally we get it as close to free as possible, but in reality, that's not always the case. But then you look at your entitlement cost per unit. So notice here how it's 25,000 per unit, because again, we have that floor to entitle. And so to get it entitled, it's basically the same to entitle this as it is like this 20 unit. Not quite, but there's a floor there. And so you have 25,000 per unit to entitle. So on the surface level, you're looking at 320, that's kind of affordable. This is 1.2 million, but then you start looking at that's 20 units here. And what I will say about this property right below it too is, we're going on the other end where they're actually asking way more for the land around it than what this is. So this deal below it also isn't a good deal because you have that economies of scale of, okay, well, you're paying 45,000 per unit and it's not even entitled. They don't even have a concept drawn up. I don't think anybody to be honest, I don't think anybody in their right mind is going to pay this price because it's not entitled. And worse, what's worse about this one below it too is in order to get this density, you'd have to go through a rezone. So that's not even certain. I wouldn't recommend any one of our clients buy this without first, well, number one is that price is way too high. Number two is it has to go through a rezone. So we wouldn't close, or even, lose earnest money until it gets through that rezone process or gets some kind of approvals. But anyway, so you go to your entitlement cost per unit. So you have 25,000 on this, 3-lot parcel. But then you go to your horizontal costs, and we have the same thing where you have a floor to horizontal because you still have to bring all the utilities in, you still have to put your road in, you still have to put your sidewalks in. And so you have a floor to that cost because it has to go the same distance whether you can do 3 units or 20 units, depending on the lot. But essentially, you know, if we could fit more on this, then this cost would go down per unit, this cost would go down per unit, this cost would go down per unit. But since we can only do three, you know, you basically have a high acquisition cost per unit. And then if we look at, you know, now you're actually on entitled and even developed land, you're actually losing money on the lot. And most of the time, I would recommend our clients don't close on something that you're going to lose money. Most of the time, we want to see if, you know, you have to exit at this point. You want to, at the bare minimum, break even or have at least the risk worth the reward, or the reward worth the risk. And so, you know, in this scenario, I wouldn't recommend at this price anybody buys this and develops it. I mean, somebody could still buy this and it could be a good little home for them, but as a development property, it's not great. But anyway, we could add three cottage units. This build cost is about the same whether it's 3 or 20. Again, you're talking maybe a couple $1,000s. So we don't show that on a high level here. That's more once we close on the property and then start you know, getting into contract once we're actually on the build side. But what we bake into all this stuff too is you know, inflationary costs and some contingency. So sometimes this is already pretty conservative. But anyway, so on this, you know, on this property, for example, like because so these, you know, this build cost isn't bad. It's the same here, you know, whether it's here or there, with 20 units, and they sell for the same price. But because your acquisition price is between your acquisition price, your horizontal, and your development, you're basically about $13,000 more per unit. That's the difference between making a little bit of money and losing money per unit. Now, these two are, you know, a good example of deals that I wouldn't have clients do. Like, and this is, you know, if you go back over to this, this line of where it shows your final investor profit, it shows that they're money losing deals, and then it shows the amount of capital you put in for those amounts. And so again, these aren't good deals for anybody. You know, you can't make money on the tail end. Then you certainly shouldn't buy it if that's your long-term goal, is to build it and sell it. Even the people that are buying these deals to, you know, I do have a couple clients that are, you know, look at these deals to buy and hold. You know, you still want it to be profitable if you have to sell, or if you sell, because ultimately that transfers over to equity on the tail end that you can then use when you refinance for cash flow, or not having to put in additional capital so that you break even, or additional capital so that you're cash flowing. A lot of times on the deals where you're making a bunch of money on it, or you have a bunch of equity, you can transfer that over to refinance on the tail end. That actually means that you're getting most of your money back, or all of your money back, and you're still cash flowing. Okay, so that's basically kind of what I wanted to show you on the difference on the economies of scale. And you can, you know, if you're have access to the list, so you can kind of go through here and see. You know, you have your acquisition costs. Notice how there's different acquisition costs on the land on all of these. And most of them, there is some kind of cost to it, but there are some that there's $0 cost. And that's because you're buying the house for the value of the house, and you're not paying extra for the land. That's easier to do on smaller lots. It's harder to do the larger the lot gets, because if you have a house sitting on 1 acre, there's usually some kind of value attached to that land, just because somebody wants a large lot, not even necessarily because of the development potential, but it's usually pretty minimal, and that's what we try to get is like pretty minimal cost. But then again, your entitlement costs, if you look at all these, anything that has, you know, more units, your entitlement cost per unit goes down. And then same thing on the development cost per lot. So like this is another good one here. So we have, this is actually a good example because I underwrote this 2 different ways, this Victory Road one. This is another cottage development. And so we had essentially, we could do it as a subdivision or as a cottage development. This is actually a perfect example of comparing the same thing or the same property, but 2 different ways of looking at it. So the entitlement costs are basically about the same, whether it's the total cost, I should say, are about the same, whether it's 5 units or 13. But because you have more units here, now you save $6,000 per unit on the entitlements. And then on the development costs, you cut that in half, even though your total development costs are a little bit higher for the cottages. In total, your total per unit is a lot less. Now, because they're cottages, if you sold the individual lots before you built them out, you would actually make less per unit, but it's per unit. So you're still making more money in total when you sell it, because this is times 13, this is times 5. And then on the build out, again, you have, the economies of scale come in more on the sale end of it, because the build cost, it actually costs more to build the smaller you build. So basically on 1,000 square foot house, it actually costs more per square foot to build than it does on a larger house. And the reason why that is if you have a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, you have 1 kitchen, you have 2 bathrooms. Well, if that is on over 1,000 square feet, those are your most expensive things to build. So your bedroom or your kitchen and bathrooms. Well, that kitchen and 2 bathrooms are going to be the same on 1,000 square foot house and a 1,500 square foot house. And then the rest of it is typical square foot costs, and those go down as you build a bigger unit. So your cost per square foot actually goes up the smaller you go, but then your resale cost actually goes up the large or the smaller you go as well. So your resale price on these, for example, are $350 a square foot, whereas your resale cost on these, what do I have? These are about 1,600 square feet. So these are under 300 a square foot. So it's about 20% difference in the resale cost. So this one, it actually pencils out really well as a cottage development, and not so great as a traditional subdivision. And that's ultimately why we're really looking at these if you guys have been following me at all or seeing my deals, I've been sending out cottage deals like crazy, because we look at these every which way, and ultimately you get more economies of scale. You have quicker turnaround. They're codified in the Boise zoning now, so they're just more efficient, and they're designed to be able to produce more affordable housing because of those economies. And you're also kind of bringing a win to the market, because ultimately you're bringing attainable housing that really doesn't exist that much in the market. So it's kind of a win for everybody. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the actual deal of the week this week. So this is a deal we actually had previously as a deal of the week. We actually sent it out as a deal of the week, and we had, I think, a couple of investors actually interested in this deal. Unfortunately, somebody got it under contract that wasn't our client before our investors could. And so it went pending. It was pending for like 2 months, and then it just came back on the market this last week. Apparently what happened is the buyer couldn't get his cash together, and so they couldn't close on it. So that's hopefully a win for our clients, because I think this is a really good deal. And I reanalyzed it this week still, even though I had some really good background on it, but we have kind of updated a few things since then, like with knowing more information. But so ultimately, just the rough numbers here. So this is there's an existing house. It's 4 bedrooms, 3 baths. It's about 3,000 square foot, and it sits on almost an acre. So your total capital invested, we actually underwrote this 3 different ways. We underwrote it, actually, we did this additionally this year, or this week, where we did it if you purchased it cash. But then this is if you just get a traditional investment loan on it. And so we have the total capital invested just under 300,000, so about 285,000. Your total profit is just shy of 600,000. When you do the math on that, when you get your total return, it's a 3.09x equity multiple, which is pretty, like, I haven't seen anybody send out those kind of deals where you're tripling your money, especially not in 2 years. And again, it comes down to the way cottages work. The way they're codified, they're a lot simpler to get entitled. They've truncated the timeline to get them entitled. You can do the development and vertical kind of at the same time, or right one after the other, and you don't have a wait time in between because you're not subdividing. So there's just all kinds of benefits to that. So you have a total ROI of 208%. I think when I did the math on this is just a simple ROI, but when I did the IRR on it, I think it was like 59.7 or 57.9, something like that. Okay, so then the way these deals, or the way this is underwritten further, so we have the house itself, that 3,000 square foot house, we know it's needs some work, but I think the value of the house is right around 550,000 even as is. It's a large house, and even without, if you don't consider that the fact that it sits on a large lot, once you know separate out the rest of the land and build on it, we think the house is still worth probably pretty close to 550,000. We haven't seen the inside yet, but we kind of have an inkling that it's going to need some work. But this is still probably pretty close to what it's actually worth. So you're getting the land for pretty close to free. And then the entitlement costs again. So this is per unit. It's about $6,600. So again, that economies of scale there. And then your development cost per unit is only about 40,000 per unit. So you're profitable on the lot when you have the infrastructure in. Now, what I will say about cottages, because this isn't a subdivision, now you could sell it at this point, but it's not like a typical subdivision where you could sell a lot to a builder or sell a lot to somebody and they buy the lot at that point, because you actually can't sell them until you have you can't sell them individually until you have the condo plat finalized, which is finalized once you start building. But you could still sell the project to a developer or builder, and that's pretty much what this pricing shows, is what we feel that the project would be worth. And ultimately, we want our clients to go through all the way to the end, because that's where, ultimately that's, where our clients make the most money. It's where we make the most money. Ultimately, I feel like it's just the best setup, and the best deal is to, have the intention of going all the way through. We just bring up the other exit points just as a backup in case something happens. So then we have your per unit construction cost, your total. This is the land acquisition, the entitlement. So this is your all-in cost, and then we have your this is the financing per unit on the construction, and then your resale value on the end cottages. I apologize about that noise if you guys can hear that in the background. It's somebody's doing lawn care, and I'm out of town, so I have no control over it. Okay, so then we have our sales cost per unit. So then your profit per unit on the cottages at the very tail end. So this is your per unit profit, and these are pretty conservative. I could actually see these selling for close to 400,000. So I mean, this is, to me, this deal is a home run all the way. And then we have the renovation of the existing house. We feel like it's going to be a pretty extensive remodel, even though we haven't seen it. This is what we anticipate the renovation cost being, right around here. And we just know that from experience doing larger homes, and like even an extensive remodel like this, we feel it's going to be right around that 200,000 mark. And then the ARV, or the rehabbed value of this is going to be at 725, looking at comparables. And then your existing sales costs. These holding costs are essentially your loan that you get on the front end on the existing property. So it actually shows you lose money on that existing home, and it's really because these holding costs and these sales costs. We just factor that into the whole development cost there. And then this is if you were to refinance the whole project. That you could do the math if you wanted to keep them, and if they would pencil out as rentals, we can do that math for you too, if that's what your strategy is. We just know most of the time right now, with the way the interest rates are, these don't typically work that way. But then we also underwrite this with, if you sold all units, just kept one, you would actually get $458,000 back. So you would actually make money, plus you retain one of the cottages for free, essentially. And then we just also underwrite this, showing this is more for like the lender underwriting. We show what our lenders look at and make sure these numbers align with this number. So that'll be probably more of an education piece later on, but when we look at this, we just want to make sure it's not too far out of line, that it'll work. Okay, so what I want to talk about is the risks with this deal. So like, when we send these deals out, a lot of times it's high level underwriting. We do spend some time, especially our deals of the week. When we send out our deals of the week, we really like double and triple check our numbers, but there's still things that we don't know. So we're not going into every one of these deals saying, okay, you're going to buy this and these are the final numbers. And, this is a sure thing. That's not what we're saying at all. So I just want to be clear about the risk going into these deals, but also how we look at those risks and how we mitigate that risk for you. So number one is like, when I just look at this deal, what are the risks with this deal specifically? So number one is we don't know the condition of the house. So this rehab number, we feel pretty confident about this, but we could get into that house and we could say, oh, you know what, it needs a new roof, it needs complete new HVAC, it needs all new plumbing, it needs all new electrical. In fact, we have to tear the whole house down to the studs. Or we could see that it is, pretty much in great shape, and it just needs a cosmetic remodel. So it could go either way. We feel like this house, just with the background that we know on it, we feel like it's going to be a higher rehab budget. So we're fairly confident in this 200,000, but what if this is 250,000? What if it's 300,000? Well, then we have to look at, okay, can the deal absorb that? And does it still make sense? So the other thing, some of you guys that have been, watching these for a little while, you'll know that, with our process, well, I'll just cover it right now. So our process, we have a 200-point due diligence checklist. So all those questions are in our due diligence. So when you're under due diligence on this house, that's once you get it under contract, we start due diligence. We don't do all the due diligence before you ever get something under contract. Just like when you go buy a regular house, you're not getting typically you're not getting a home inspection before you get the house under contract, because that's a whole lot of wasted energy, time, and money if you ultimately don't get that house under contract. And so what I will say is the first step is to get anything under contract. If this high level underwriting looks good, typically it ends up pretty good, but there are instances where, we get to the end of that due diligence and we say, you know what, this isn't the same deal. In fact, we had one just a few weeks ago where we got through the due diligence and it wasn't the same deal at the end of due diligence as it was at the beginning. And so our client didn't end up closing on it. We also had a deal a couple months ago where we got through due diligence and we went from doing a subdivision to looking at it. Okay, let's look at this as a cottage development. And not only that, but we did further due diligence and the underwriting changed from, they were going to make like 550,000 to we guarantee we have our profit guarantee, so we guaranteed at the end of due diligence that it was going to be 900,000, but the underwriting looked like it was going to be over $1 million. And so this can go up or down based on that due diligence. So I just want to be upfront about that this isn't like, this high level isn't the final underwriting, but the risk is, here is that we don't know that rehab budget until we put together that final rehab budget. We're estimating at this point, so this could go up or down based on that rehab. In fact, since, the first time that we sent this out a deal where we had no information on the house, this was actually a little bit higher profit because we thought the rehab was going to be like 100,000, maybe it was 130, I think we had. And so we actually increased this based on just some of the feedback that we got from the people that drove by it and talking to the listing agent. Okay, so what other risk can we have? So another risk would be on the development costs. So again, I have a really good idea what these development costs are going to be because of just the deals that we've done, the deals that we've analyzed. We currently have a deal almost exactly like this. That's actually more units, but we know what that infrastructure has to be that's going to have to go in. But there's still some unknowns. Like, do we know like one of the biggest unknowns sometimes that comes up on properties is, they might have irrigation lines, but we don't really know anything about those until we actually it takes a little bit more research to find out about that. And do we have to relocate those irrigation lines? Do we have to replace all the irrigation lines? On some of the properties where we know there's irrigation, we just factor that into the cost. But most properties, you don't really have to deal with that, especially on the cottage villages, because they're just not the same as the subdivision. But that's something that there's certain things that we come up with during due diligence where we find out, okay, we need to add this, or, you know, we thought we were gonna have to do this, but we don't have to do it now, and this cost went down. And so this number again can go up or down, but because we already start at that base level, this number, even if you have to, like on this deal, if we had to add a budget for irrigation, you know, this might go up by, you know, 10,000 per unit, which ultimately is 100 grand. And again, you know, maybe this turns into, instead of 600, it's 500. And is it a good deal still? Now, most of the time when you go through this, the number fluctuates a little bit, but usually it's pretty close to that. Entitlement costs are pretty dialed in unless you run into, you know, some unknowns during due diligence, like additional engineering, or, you know, again, there's, if we're looking at, you know, something like on hillside, we typically know that that's going to cost more. There's just more engineering costs with that, or if it's in the floodplain or something. So we typically know those costs up front. So we already have that in our underwriting. So this number is usually pretty close, even at the end of due diligence. Just what can change sometimes is this number, and then also this number. The other risk that we run into, so just, you know, obviously with development in general, so, you know, you're looking at a long-term project. It's not a fix and flip where you have set construction prices, or, well, even on fix and flips, you don't even know, like, until you break down the walls, you have no idea what those costs are going to be until you actually do the demo. But what I will say on new construction, so you pretty much have those costs. You kind of have known costs with new construction. But what's different is a year from now, you know, in 2021, when prices were skyrocketing, nobody anticipated, you know, construction costs going up 30% in a year. So that was one risk that almost nobody looked at. We do bake in contingency and even inflation into these costs. So we mitigate that risk a little bit, but a year from now, if we go through a crazy, you know, inflationary period, you know, maybe this costs 230 to build the same unit. Now, typically what we've seen in the past is, you know, inflation works both ways. Again, this number here typically is going to go in the same direction, but not always. But again, we're also not projecting out. This is what this would sell in the market today, we feel. Now, 2 years from now, more than likely, the way the market is going right now, and unless something changes, more than likely, this isn't going to increase a ton, but it's more than likely going to be at least a little bit higher. But we don't project that. So again, I could see this selling for 400,000 even today. But you know, 2 years from now, it might be 420,000. Again, we're not going to project that out. We're going to look at today's numbers. These numbers actually already factor in some contingency and inflation. So we try to be conservative on these. And then what we do to basically kind of give people peace of mind. So obviously I've covered the risks on these. You know, the other risk would be like if you have construction take way longer than it should, your interest rates can go up. So we do everything we can to make sure that we're dialed in on the timeline, and we work with contractors. I've actually had to work through, you know, multiple subcontractors in order to get those dialed in so that we don't have those unexpected delays with our subcontractors. And then on top of that, I have my, you know, my go-to subcontractors, but I also have backup subcontractors, because if one subcontractor, you know, this was especially the case in COVID, maybe they have a couple guys get sick, or, you know, they get extra busy for a certain period, you know, you have to be able to move on to the next one just like that. You have to make the decision really quickly, because even a 2-week wait on a subcontractor leads to thousands of dollars in costs. And so we really try to eliminate that by making sure that we can move quickly. We also schedule guys out front, out in advance, months in advance, and then keep them up to date on the schedule. So if anything changes on the schedule, they get alerts, they confirm. We double check and confirm with them to make sure that they can show up on time when we need them. And if they can't, then we, you know, if it's reasonable, we'll still stick with them. But if it's going to delay more than like a week or 2 weeks max, then we're going to move on to the next. And sometimes you can, you know, you can kind of work around them a little bit to some extent, but yeah, that's just something that we do to make sure we're mitigating this cost, is making sure that we can move as quickly as possible on the construction. And then and then basically to give people, our investors, a peace of mind is we have our profit guarantee, and that's ultimately, you know, we put that in place because we know that our investors are, a lot of you guys are experienced investors, but you haven't done development or building. So you're probably well aware of the risk in real estate investing in general. You just don't know exactly how development and building works. So we understand you're relying a lot on us. And so that's why we put our profit guarantee in. So we guarantee each project a minimum of 50,000 up to 200,000, depending on how many units it is. And so once we get to the end of due diligence and have that projected profits on this deal, so if we get to the end of due diligence and we say, okay, we project this is going to make 594,000, that's going to be our profit guarantee. And then we're going to back that up with it's going to be backed by a max of 200,000. So essentially, if we get to the end of the deal and it only makes 550,000, we're going to kick in that extra 44,000. So you get up to your minimum profit projected. Or, and again, it's not risk free. I don't want to make that a claim at all. We're not saying you're guaranteed to make this amount of money. What we are saying is that we're putting our own skin in the game, and if it doesn't make what we projected and we guaranteed, then we're going to make sure that we basically hold aside money that we kick in until it does, up to a total of $200,000 on this deal. So it could make only 394,000. We'll still kick in that 200,000 to get you up to the 594. So you have, that's basically 20,000 per home that we're going to kick in if it doesn't make this projected, if this is the final projected amount. So basically, it's a way to hold us accountable, but also it's a way for us to kind of give you some peace of mind that we're taking on risk as well, and making sure that we're accountable, because there's a lot of control that we have to make sure that it's profitable for you. And so we're not just the builder that's going to take a paycheck. We're going to make sure that we have the skin in the game too, and we're essentially backing up what we're telling you on the front end. Okay, let me stop my share here. I actually want to show the layout of the site because I haven't covered this deal yet. Okay, so this project, so there's an existing home. This is a 3,000 square foot home. It's at the front of the lot. What's actually great about this property, there's already a driveway access point right here. And so we don't have to do much there. I think with ACHD and the city and everything, I think they're going to approve the location of the driveways. So we don't have to do any major, construction there, moving the driveways. This will just get paved. This is where we'll bring in all the utilities. We have plenty of parking. We have almost one or two units per or two parking spots per unit. Requirement is only one. And then these will all be 1,000 square foot, 3-bedroom, 2-bath cottages. Now there is actually like a really good open spot in the middle here. This can either be kept open and as a grassy area, or we could even look at, if it makes sense to do some kind of additional amenities. Those aren't required, but we could, look at, okay, does it make sense to maybe put a pool in there or a clubhouse, something like that. If it's worth the cost to get it on the resale end, we could look at doing something like that. It may not, and it could be something too that we just say, maybe the homeowners association wants to save up for that at some point if it makes sense for everybody. But these are the 11 units back here. Again, with the cottages, a big reason why you save a lot of money on the horizontal costs is because you don't have to have a road that goes to each individual one. So you have centralized utilities and location and parking and driveway access. This is a central trash collection here. I did kind of change this from how I previously sent it out, and I made sure that we had a fire turnaround in here. Didn't change the site much. We just want to make sure we have it laid out realistically. And then the existing house can basically stay the same. We know that it's probably going to take a remodel, but then this can be sold off individually as it'd be part of the same condo development. We could even look at, it might make sense even to turn the existing house into a multifamily property. So like a duplex or a triplex. There's actually incentives with the city of Boise to do that as well, if it makes sense. I haven't seen the layout, so I don't know if it would easily do that or not. I know it's big enough, you could pretty easily turn it into a duplex. But I don't know like layout wise if it would make sense or not. So that's something we can look at during due diligence. We didn't underwrite it that way. We underwrote it as a single family house. But it could be make even more sense if we can turn it into a duplex and you keep that as a rental. Okay, for the people that are online here, any questions? Okay, so we don't have any questions here. I'm just gonna kind of go through a recap here and yeah, so basically, we covered a little bit of education today. We covered the deal of the week, covered the rest of the deal. But really, if you got value from today's episode, here's what I want you to do if you're listening to this or watching it on YouTube. Just don't just subscribe and disappear. Go to the link in the description and get on our infill deal list. Every Friday, we're going to be looking at new properties hitting the market and breaking down the opportunities that we think could create significant value through infill development. And then you also get access to our educational content, so you can learn how we're analyzing these deals. Even if you're not ready to buy one yet, the education is a great piece, and it can basically add to your confidence when it is time to buy. And then if you're looking for your next six-figure real estate opportunity, this is ultimately where we want you to be every week, is to be watching this live or watching the replays and ready to bounce on something that makes sense to you. So click on the link, get on the list, and I'll see you next Friday when we break down the next infill deal of the week. All right, thanks guys for showing up.